You know that quiet moment when you're scrolling through your phone and you pause for just a second longer than usual. Someone your age just bought a house. Someone else got promoted. Another one is traveling, smiling, announcing something that sounds like progress. And you're not even jealous. Not exactly. It's something softer than that. Just a small, almost unnoticeable shift in your chest, like you've missed a step somewhere, and now you're trying to figure out when it happened. Most people don't talk about that feeling directly. When they do, it usually gets labeled in simple ways. Lack of discipline, poor planning, not working hard enough, or sometimes the opposite, being too sensitive, too indecisive, too unfocused. As if the feeling itself is a kind of personal failure. But that interpretation misses something important, because what looks like falling behind is often something else entirely, something patterned, something shared. And this is where it starts to become clearer. Because the feeling we're talking about, the sense of being left behind, shows up in a very specific group of people, in a very specific way. It's not random. It's not just about individual choices. It's deeply tied to a generation that was told to expect one kind of world, and then had to learn how to live in a completely different one. The psychology of millennials who feel left behind isn't really about failure. It's about misalignment. And there's more going on here than most people realize. If you look at it from a psychological perspective, the human brain is constantly building internal timelines, quiet expectations about when things are supposed to happen, not consciously most of the time, more like background assumptions. By a certain age, you'll be stable. By another, you'll feel secure. Eventually, things will start to make sense. These timelines aren't created in isolation. They're shaped by culture, by media, by the people around us. And for a long time, those signals were relatively consistent. But for many millennials, those timelines were formed during a period of relative predictability, and then reality shifted. Economic instability, changing job markets, rising living costs, delayed milestones. The external structure changed, but the internal timeline didn't update at the same speed. So what you end up with is a kind of psychological lag. Your life isn't necessarily off track, but your expectations still think it is. Neuroscience helps explain why that mismatch feels so uncomfortable. The brain is constantly comparing current reality to expected reality. When there's a gap, it triggers a subtle stress response. Not panic, not crisis, just a persistent sense that something isn't quite right. Over time, that feeling can become familiar. It shows up as restlessness, self-doubt, a low-level pressure that doesn't have a clear source, and because it's not dramatic, it's easy to dismiss even as it shapes how you see yourself. There's also the role of comparison, which works a little differently now than it used to. In previous generations, comparison was local. You measured your life against the people you actually knew. Now, it's ambient, constant. You're exposed to curated snapshots of thousands of lives, all moving at different speeds, all highlighting their most visible moments of progress. And the brain doesn't fully register that this is a distorted sample. It processes it as data, evidence, a kind of ongoing reminder that other timelines exist and that yours might not match them. But this isn't just about social media or external pressure. It goes deeper than that. Because many millennials were raised with a particular narrative about effort and reward. Work hard, stay consistent, make the right choices and things will stabilize. That belief isn't wrong exactly, but it assumes a level of predictability that hasn't always been there. So when outcomes don't match effort, the brain tries to make sense of it, and often it turns inward. Maybe I did something wrong. Maybe I'm not where I should be. What's easy to miss is that this response is not a flaw. It's a form of pattern seeking. The brain is trying to restore coherence. It wants your life to make sense according to the rules it was given. And when those rules no longer apply cleanly, it doesn't immediately discard them. It holds on to them. It keeps trying to solve a system that has quietly changed. If you trace this back a little further, you can see how early experiences play a role. Not in a dramatic way, but in a cumulative one. The messages you absorbed growing up, the examples you saw, the way success was defined, even indirectly. Over time, those inputs shape your internal model of what a normal life looks like. And once that model is in place, it becomes a reference point, not something you actively think about, but something you feel against. So when your actual life starts to diverge from that model, the reaction isn't just practical, it's emotional. It can feel like uncertainty, but also like disorientation. As if you're slightly out of sync with something invisible, and because everyone else seems to be moving, or at least appearing to move, that feeling becomes more pronounced. Not necessarily because they're ahead, but because your frame of reference is still fixed. It's important to say this clearly. This isn't better or worse than any other experience. It's not a sign that something is wrong with you, and it's not evidence that others are doing life correctly. Different people move through different systems, with different expectations at different times. Some align early, some realign later. Neither is inherently more valid. But here's where it becomes more interesting and maybe a little less obvious. That feeling of being left behind often comes with something else, a kind of heightened awareness. You start noticing the structure itself, the assumptions, the timelines, the invisible rules people are following. And once you see that clearly, it becomes harder to move through life on autopilot. You don't just follow a path, you question it, and that creates a quiet paradox. Because the same awareness that makes you feel out of sync is also what allows you to eventually build something more intentional. But in the moment, it doesn't feel like clarity. It feels like hesitation, like you're taking longer to decide, longer to commit, longer to settle. And from the outside, that can look like falling behind. From the inside, it often feels like trying to get it right. There's a kind of invisible cost to that. When you're more aware of your choices, you also become more aware of their consequences. You see more possibilities, but also more trade-offs. And that can slow things down. Not because you're incapable of moving forward, but because you're less willing to move forward unconsciously. And if you've been in that space for a while, it can start to shape how you see yourself. Not in obvious ways, but in small, repeated thoughts. Maybe I'm late. Maybe I missed something. Maybe everyone else figured it out sooner. Those thoughts aren't loud, but they're persistent, and over time, they start to feel like facts. But they're not facts. They're interpretations, and they're built on a timeline that may no longer reflect the world you're actually living in. And when you begin to see that, really see it, something subtle starts to shift. Not all at once, not in a dramatic way, but in how you interpret your own pace. Because what once felt like delay starts to look more like divergence. Not falling behind, but moving along a different timeline that doesn't have as many visible markers. There's a reason this realization takes time. The brain doesn't easily let go of shared timelines, especially the ones that were reinforced early and often. They offer a kind of structure, even when they no longer fit. Letting go of them can feel like stepping into something less defined, and the human mind doesn't always find comfort in open space. It prefers clarity, even if that clarity is outdated. But over time, many people begin to notice something unexpected. The things they once felt late to start to matter less in the same way. Not because they've given up on them, but because their relationship to them has changed. A career becomes less about catching up, and more about alignment. Stability becomes less about hitting a deadline, and more about building something that actually holds. Even success starts to feel less like a moment you arrive at, and more like a pattern you live within. This doesn't happen because external pressure disappears. If anything, the world continues to move quickly. People still achieve things at different times. Milestones are still visible, still celebrated, but your interpretation of those signals begins to soften. You notice them, but they don't define you in the same way. The comparison becomes quieter, less sharp, more contextual. There's also a deeper layer to this, something that isn't always obvious at first. When you step outside of a fixed timeline, you also step outside of a fixed identity. You're no longer just the person who is on track or off track. You become harder to categorize, even to yourself. And while that can feel uncertain, it also opens up a kind of flexibility that isn't available when everything is tightly defined. From a behavioral perspective, this flexibility matters. It allows for experimentation, for changing direction without interpreting it as failure, for building a life in pieces rather than following a preset sequence. And while that path can look less efficient from the outside, it often leads to something more internally consistent over time. Of course, there's still a trade-off. When your path isn't easily visible, it's also not easily validated. You don't always get the external confirmation that you're doing the right thing, and that can bring the feeling back, in quieter forms. A question in the back of your mind, a moment of doubt when you compare yourself again. This isn't something that disappears completely. It just becomes something you understand differently. And understanding it changes how it feels. Because instead of asking, why am I behind? The question becomes, behind what exactly? Behind whose timeline? Behind which version of success? And once those questions are clear, the original feeling loses some of its certainty. It becomes less like a conclusion and more like a signal, one that can be examined, rather than believed automatically. There's also something else that begins to emerge here. Something quieter, but more stable. When you're not constantly measuring your life against a fixed schedule, you start to notice what actually matters to you, independent of timing. Not what looks right or what appears impressive, but what feels sustainable. What you can return to consistently. What holds your attention over time without constant external pressure. And that's often where a different kind of progress begins. Slower, maybe, less visible, but also less fragile. Because progress built on comparison tends to fluctuate. It rises and falls depending on what others are doing. But progress built on internal alignment tends to hold. It doesn't rely on constant confirmation. It doesn't collapse as easily when circumstances change. If you've been feeling left behind, it's likely you've been operating with a level of awareness that doesn't always get recognized. You've been noticing the gaps, the inconsistencies, the shifts in the system, and instead of ignoring them, you've been trying to make sense of them. That process can feel like stagnation from the outside, but internally, it's often a form of recalibration. And recalibration takes time. It's not as visible as milestones. It doesn't come with announcements or clear markers, but it shapes everything that comes after. The decisions you make, the paths you choose, the things you commit to, and the things you quietly decide not to. So if part of you still feels like you're behind, it might be worth holding that feeling a little more gently. Not trying to push it away, but also not accepting it at face value. Just noticing it for what it is, a response to a set of expectations that may no longer apply in the same way. Because there's a difference between being behind and simply being somewhere that isn't easily measured. And if any part of this felt familiar, if it sounded like something you've been trying to put into words without quite getting there, then there's probably more to explore. Not in a way that fixes you, but in a way that helps you understand yourself a little more clearly.